For me, as you know, the sequence of movement in Egypt has been very important, in fact, for many reasons. First, I think that in the general Middle East, Egypt is a very important point. In my opinion, a decisive point in some sense. So, what happened in Egypt is very important for me at the level of the global political movement in the world, in some sense. And so it's the first reason, but after that it is also because the form of the movement was in some sense something new. It was a new form which was to take the power somewhere, in some sense. Not at the level of the state, but to organize some form of collective decision which is during a long time, in some sense, for a movement, naturally, to organize a new space which is between a real position and a symbolic position, which can create something which is a political symbol for many people, and also to unify some important differences inside the people, between Copts and Muslims, and so on. All that was very interesting for me. And it was not the product of old politics. It was something, naturally old politics was also present. There is something paradoxical in the result of the movement, in the form of Muslim brothers taking the power, to organize military on one side, Muslim brothers on the other side, were in the position to really take the power, but not the movement as such. The revolutionary part of the movement was not in some sense its position to really be a candidate to the power. It's a historic lesson when we have no new form of organization, not old forms of organization, but if the movement cannot create some new form of organization at the level of the state power, the result is that something which is an organization in Muslim Brothers finally takes the power. And after that we have the return to the whole situation with, for military camp, a lesson too. Never something like that. But the movement as such was a new proposition. My name for all that has been a new birth of history. And so the destiny of all that, the becoming of all that, was for me a very important question. Not only the question of victory and failure. In fact, my question was, and it's a question, what was exactly the possible concept of victory of that sort of movement? In a sense, it's a very profound and difficult question. Because it's very difficult to imagine that you have a new form of movement and the classical form of result of the movement. That is to seize the power, something like that. So, my question is, what was exactly the goal of the movement? At the level of the thinking of people, at the level of what we say. Because you have a clear negative point. no Mubarak. And in some sense, the unity of the movement first is with a negative dimension, which is against the existing power. But naturally, we cannot exclude that the becoming of all that will be, okay, no Mubarak, but al-Sisi. Finale with al-Sisi, Mubarak. And so we must have, when there is a new movement, we must have an understanding of what is the goal of the movement, not in purely negative terms, no Mubarak, not in classical terms, with size of the power as it is. What is the idea of real change? In fact, finally, my judgment, and really I was passionate for the Egyptian movement. And my judgment is the movement as such was something new in the historical sequence of today, the level of the world, not only for Egypt. So after that we have a movement everywhere, but all those movements are in some sense less interesting than the Egyptian movement, which was big, which was long, which was with many complex composition. And we have so a new movement, but you have the negative dimension of the movement, which is clear against the power, against Mubarak. And we have the circle, which is that finally there is no novelty, there is no something new at the level of the goal of all that. Beyond negativity, if you want. Because what was the vision of inside the movement itself? If these questions were present in the movement, what was the discussion concerning some point? No, because all details are of importance about that sort of question. Because the birth of something is always an obscure process. What is clear is that you have something like a new form of movement, you know, at the level of the novelty, at the level of the novelty of the movement itself. And it's a question for everybody, no? It's of universal interest. Because you can understand, finally, it's the question of what is today a revolution. Which is not insurrectional, which is not the classical fight, military fight, power, it's not something like that. It's not purely localized, even if it's a place, it's a symbolic place. I was interested by the idea, we are the true Egyptians here. Egypt is here. not only some thousands of people, but we are symbolically, we are the possibility of a new Egypt here. Yes, but beyond this symbolic vision, in some sense, what is the truly political vision? Have you not a solution? No problem.